It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 51. Yeah, it's been a while since episode number 50. And honestly, there just hasn't been a whole lot going on. At least not a lot of really interesting stuff in the world of creationism over the last couple of weeks. But a couple things are starting to heat up, and I've parsed together what I think are the most interesting stories from the last couple of weeks that I haven't highlighted on other videos. And so we're going to talk about leadership changes just announced at Answers in Genesis. And in doing that, we'll talk a little bit about the future of Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham. Oh, feathered dinosaurs, they're at it again. Answers in Genesis just cannot leave the topic of feathered dinosaurs alone. And so we have to talk about it a little bit, see what they're up to. Another article on Tenrec origins. What is a Tenrec, you ask? Well, stick around, we'll find out. And Ice Age questions. We've got that and a bunch more coming right up. Let's do it. Let's just get right to the big topic. I think this is the most important development over the last couple weeks. And that is the announcement just a few days ago by Ken Ham that Martyn Iles is joining Answers in Genesis as Chief Ministry Officer. It's caught me completely off guard. I didn't even know who Martyn Iles was when I heard about this. No clue. Who is this Martyn Iles? And how does he come to Answers in Genesis? Ken Ham had a blog post. He's been on a video. He's been invited to talk. Actually, he's been at a couple talks for Answers in Genesis over the last year. But the most important thing to know about him is he's from Australia. All right, so he's got the requisite accent to be a leader at Answers in Genesis and follow in the footsteps of Ken Ham. Now, whether he comes to be the successor of Ken Ham or not will remain to be seen, but he's certainly been placed in a position that would lend itself to sliding into that role eventually. So it would behoove us to know something about who Martyn Iles is and what is the direction of Answers in Genesis. In fact, I think this tells us something about the future direction of Answers in Genesis, although it's not really the future direction of Answers in Genesis. This is already what Answers in Genesis has become. And by appointing Martyn Iles as Chief Ministry Officer, we're seeing just who Answers in Genesis is right now, what it's been for the last couple of years. And this is the clearest indication that Answers in Genesis is a Christian apologetics ministry focused on the culture wars, right? I mean, that really is the focus of Ken Ham, and that's where the focus is going to remain. This is not a creation science apologetics ministry. This isn't a ministry that's developing tools for understanding questions about science and faith. Those are very secondary to Answers in Genesis these days. All right, so what do I mean by that? In his introduction, Ken Ham's introduction to Martyn Iles to his audience, so here Ken Ham's he's excited about bringing in this Martyn Iles. But I'm sure that Ken Ham has to understand that his American audience has no idea who this is. Right? So rather than somebody from inside who's a familiar face and voice at Answers in Genesis, here we have a completely new face, a completely new voice, entering onto a very large stage and is apparently going to take a very prominent role. Here is Martyn Iles' description himself, quoted by Ken Ham, about what he thinks his responsibilities are going to be. So here's Martyn Iles saying, Answers in Genesis is a large Christian apologetics and education ministry. There you go. That's his impression of what Answers in Genesis is. That's different than what I think some of the other groups would talk about, because they would talk about some emphasis on sort of scientific apologetics, scientific Christian apologetics. Also known for owning the famous Ark Encounter and Creation Museum. You see, they're a Christian apologetics ministry and educational ministry first. And then they also, on the side, have this Ark Encounter and Creation Museum. I'll be aiding in the overall leadership, notice that word right there, the overall leadership of the ministry with CEO Ken Ham, who is a fellow Australian, even a Queenslander, no less. All right, so Ken Ham has plucked from his homeland somebody who is now going to take a major leadership role at Answers in Genesis, potentially taking his place when he finally steps aside. My role is to continue to advance and adapt the ministry to an emerging generation and changing culture. I will produce a lot of content, speak at live events all over the world, write books, design educational programs, and more. Right? In other words, he's going to be a prominent voice. He's going to be a prominent writer for Answers in Genesis. He is going to be setting the direction and the tone, all right, in a lot of respects for the materials that come out of Answers in Genesis in the future. Also, I will lead the Australian office of the ministry, make sure that Australia doesn't miss out. All right, Australia is still important to me. Of course, Ken Ham said very similar things when he left ICR out in California to start the ministry here, he had recently come from Australia to come to ICR, and emphasized that he really cares about his homeland and the fact that they need this ministry of creation ministry. Well, years later, he did maintain a highly visible creation ministry in Australia, which was Answers in Genesis, the Australian branch. But of course, he eventually divorced them, right? They are now Christian Ministries International, which is also based in North America and Atlanta today. So we'll see, right? He's got to throw in this, I've got my followers, right? The base of Martyn Iles' followers, the people who know him, all right, and brought him to the position he has of some notoriety, right, in Australia, are Australians. But he's going to be now working in the U.S. AiG has a workforce up to 1,200 people, so we can do it all. To this end, I'll shortly be moving to the Cincinnati area full-time, though I'll continue to visit Australia. Right, so who is this Martyn Iles? I told you I didn't recognize the name when it was announced that he was going to play a major role at Answers in Genesis. And of course, many have speculated exactly what is this transition going to look like from Ken Ham to what comes next. Right? He has a brother-in-law who has a very prominent leadership role at Answers in Genesis as well, Bodie Hoge. And although Bodie Hoge has not been the most forward-facing person over the last year or so, I've talked about Bodie Hoge, and I saw him talk recently at the ARC Encounter. I think he's an entertaining, energetic speaker. I think he has a much better rapport with his audience than even Ken Ham does, but he certainly doesn't have some of the innate charisma that people think that Ken Ham has. But I've always just assumed that Bodie Hoge was probably in position to sort of take over the major reins of Answers in Genesis. But maybe not. This all remains to be seen. It's speculation, of course, what's going to happen to them in the future. But I'm interested. So who is this Martyn Iles? And remember what he's doing. He's going to be the director, all right? What was the wording here? He's going to be the overall leadership of ministry. And you say joining as Chief Ministry Officer, right? So Chief Ministry Officer. Now, when I think of Chief Ministry Officer, and you don't see it here, but on his Facebook page, he has himself standing in what's obviously a mega church with thousands of people watching. And he talks about sort of preaching, and he's done many jobs where he incorporates, in which he is actively a Christian working in a variety of different kind of ministries, but not pastorship ministries. All right. So look at his college experience. Right. He studied at the University of Queensland, got a Bachelor of Law or Laws in 2012. And then he went to Australian National University where he has a Master in Laws in 2015. And he does have this, I think he's board certified lawyer. Right. And that then got him jobs at Human Rights Law Alliance from 2015 to 2018. And then he has been the managing director at the Australian Christian Lobby since 2018, in which there was just a recent, we'll say, divorce from him. As typically these types of things go. We've had a change in our, disagreement about the direction that this ministry should go. And therefore they parted with their leader, who was Martyn Iles. Right. Now, I've gone out and I've watched a couple YouTube videos from him and done a little bit to sort of hear his style and thinking. And it won't surprise you that the way he talks, right, the issues he's interested in, and his approach, all right, to apologetics is very similar to Ken Ham's. And by interests, I mean sort of these culture war things that he's very much engaged in. You can see he's in various lobbying agencies and so forth. You notice what's missing here? A couple things missing from his background. He doesn't really have any ministry background. He talks in one place about doing some sort of youth ministry or youth leadership, sort of like youth leader at a church. He's obviously grown up in the church, but he's much like a lot of independent churches today, independent Christian churches today, where you have a person inside that church that simply is in the church, and then they become more active and they start leading different things. And eventually people are like, you're an awesome leader, let's make you the youth pastor. And then the youth pastor, after a while, graduates to becoming maybe an associate pastor who's actually doing more preaching, and then maybe a full-time preacher, but never has any kind of like seminary training. Now, of course, Ken Ham's not too thrilled with seminary training because he thinks all seminaries are corrupt. He calls them cemeteries, right? You go there to learn about an old earth and to become corrupted, and doesn't seem to understand or see the value in that kind of training for ministry. Now, that to me is hard to understand, and you have to understand something about my own background, right? Being Presbyterian, I'm very used to an educated pastor. One that knows their Greek and knows their Hebrew and has taken courses on hermeneutics, right? The how do we interpret and understand the Bible, all right? Methods of reading and being able to have read a wide body of literature, maybe actually studied something about being a pastor and the challenges of being pastor, and maybe some of the social aspects of that, how to deal with people, right? There's a lot of different kinds of training that goes on in a seminary that allows one to develop the skills of being a pastor and a leader. This is, self-taught, obviously. And just like Ken Ham is self-taught, right? Yeah, he has a college degree and some kind of basic science, right? And was a high school science teacher for a short period of time. And now he's sort of seen as Christians as sort of this Christian apologetics, right? Even though he doesn't have any training in that particular area, it's all self-taught. Now, I believe I know people that are self-taught and are amazing, right? Are as smart as anyone who's gone through years of college. But of course, they've also dedicated themselves to actually reading tons of literature and understanding and discussing. Martyn Iles is very much in the ilk of Ken Ham's leadership style, which is simply finding people that say the right things and have the right beliefs. Not that they are well versed in these areas that they're going to discuss. They simply have the right views, and he certainly does have the right pedigree for Ken Ham. In my mind, not the right pedigree for leadership of a very influential outreach ministry. So also interesting, I found no mention of Martyn Iles on the AiG website before 2022. That's when he's first mentioned, because he's going to be a speaker at an Answers in Genesis conference in Australia. Not talking about science or creationism or whatever. Now, he says he believes in a young earth and ascribes to all those basic foundational points that he would be required to ascribe to if he's going to work for Answers in Genesis. But that's not something that's strongly in his background. He's never, as far as I know, he's probably read some Answers in Genesis books, and he could answer a few questions about a young earth, but he's certainly no expert in the sort of the scientific realm or even the area of science and faith, right? How much does he know about that particular field and area of discussion? Because that's something he's going to be really important. Well, so he is an unknown to Answers in Genesis audience, only recently been invited to talk at a conference, and now all of a sudden he's CEO of ministries there, right? And education, outreach. I'm sure he's going to have a lot to do with the new corporate headquarters and probably the media empire that was continuing to grow at Answers in Genesis over time. All right, so that's Martyn Iles. I will just say this about him, since I don't know much about him. I kind of imagine that this is, I don't know how this went down, but I find it interesting that Ken Ham has found somebody from Australia to sort of come by his side and possibly follow him up. I guess it helps to have that accent, because people love that Australian accent. But I wonder how other people at Answers in Genesis feel that have devoted a large portion of their life working there. Doesn't seem to be a lot of upward mobility if you're simply going to bring somebody else in to take over. And maybe that's because there wasn't anybody internally that sort of had the right charisma level or the right dedication to the vision that Ken Ham has for the future of his organization, and it is his organization. And so he has found somebody he thinks that can secure that path and follow his vision. And clearly Martyn Iles is a pretty gifted speaker. And like I said, he has this sort of charisma, and he has following in Australia, but he doesn't have following in the US. So he's got a long way to go in terms of becoming familiar to those in his audience. But I'm sure Ken Ham will have a couple of years of him being, more front and center for him to become accepted by the American audience. The question is, how much is he getting accepted internally, in-house, as sort of coming in and ruling over a bunch of other people that might have felt like that was their place to be in the future. This is just, part and parcel of what happens at every corporation and the types of decisions they have to make in terms of, moving on and how they go about their transitions in leadership. One other thing about Martyn Iles, and this doesn't directly have to do with him, but I just want to show you what he's, when he talks about this being a big organization, right, and having 1,000 more employees involved in lots of different things, and he's going to be overseeing some of those. You probably can't read these very well, but these are all the different ministries that Answers in Genesis has, right? They're all branded various things. So of course you have the Ark Encounter, the Creation Museum. Those are your two big ones that everyone's heard about. So here we have attraction brands, right? So the Ark Encounter is a brand. Creation Museum is a brand. And within the Ark Encounter, you have, the Answers Center is a location there. You have the zoo there. You've got the actual Ark, right? And then at the Creation Museum, you have a number of different ministries and shows and endeavors, operations that are happening there. And then we have over here, what is this? On-demand services. So if you didn't know it, there's all kinds of show, right? They have Answers TV, which is a subscription service. You can pay a monthly fee, so your kids and yourself will have all kinds of Answers in Genesis vetted material for them to watch. Right? They have their Answers news program, so really that comes within Answers TV. And this is a large part of what their new operation is going to be, is I think expanding this kind of stuff. And then these are various shows that they develop, right? That are developed by Answers in Genesis. They also have purchased or renting or subscribing to other materials that are also loaded onto Answers TV to provide more content. But the basic idea is they're trying to produce more and more and more and more content. You can think of it as a long-term project to be something like a Netflix, Netflix competitor. And then you've got their educational stuff, right? You've got this whole high school labs thing, and they've got a whole bunch of different curricula for that. They've got their vacation Bible school curricula. All right, and they also have, and within that, they also have curricula for your K through 12 school, because they have their own school, 12 Stones, and then they also have Answers for pastors and leaders. That's a whole nother arm of Answers in Genesis that is a ministry that's trying to reach pastors and leaders to give them the right materials so that they can teach their congregation. So they run a bunch of conferences. Right, so they have conferences each year, and they've got all these branded conferences. I've been to like the Creation College Expo myself. I've actually done a number of these different things. And then you've got other brands that even support this and are sort of like other side projects. All right. So, of course, Ken Ham has a brand himself, right? He's got his own blog, and of course, he has his own Facebook page and so forth. So he has his own brand going along with Answers in Genesis. Right. So this is the growing ministry of Answers in Genesis, right? If I were to show you a flow chart from ICR or Creation Ministries International, you'd find that it's far less extensive, right? They have a few things going on because they only have a tenth or much less, well, way less than a tenth of the employees, because Ark Encounter and Creation Museum have a huge number of employees. But even in terms of the office producing materials, generating videos and so forth, Answers in Genesis just completely dominates the scene in terms of producing materials. That's why I spend a lot of time on talking about Answers in Genesis. They're the ones that are influencing the whole field of young Earth creationism. But looking at this, you can see that a lot of this isn't young Earth creationism, right? In fact, the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter are sort of based on young Earth creationism as their foundational sort of founding reason for being, I guess the focal point, right? Creation and the Ark Encounter of Noah's flood. But really, even all the other ministries that you would go and you would, the types of exhibits you would see there, grow way outside of sort of the creation science sort of realm. And so the totality of Answers in Genesis is of overall Christian apologetics, right? Founded upon a particular view of Genesis, which kind of permeates all these other different ministries. Let's move on. Let's just quickly hit a couple other articles just so you know what's going on with Answers in Genesis and a few other creationist organizations. So Answers in Genesis, it just cannot let go of the Dino-bird thing. Every time somebody mentions that there is a dinosaur fossil out there, or a fossil that has dinosaur-like features but also bird-like features, they feel like they have to write something about it to their audience to tell them, don't worry, don't get too worried about this. They're misinterpreting the evidence. They're trying to make you think that there's a relationship between dinosaurs and birds. But if we just look through this with biblical eyes, that there's only birds and that there's dinosaurs and there's nothing in between, that God didn't make any kind of creatures that have combinations of these features. And as long as we can explain away one of the features or another feature, we can take all the different fossils and we can either push them through the square box on the pegboard and turn them into a dinosaur, or we'll push them through the round hole and we'll get them to be birds. And to get them to be birds, they simply have to have feathers, right? And this particular fossil has feathers. So even though it has other characteristics that are kind of dinosaur-like or fit a lot of other dinosaurs, those features also can be found in some other bird-like organisms as well. So they're more bird-like, so they are birds, besides they have feathers. That's the distinguishing characteristic, again, in their mind. And this, who do we have writing this article? Well, we've got Dr. Haynes, their new paleontologist, who has been adamantly writing articles about this non-existent link between dinosaurs and birds. And therefore, there can't ever be any kind of fossils that would suggest such a link between the two. And all such suggestions have to be eliminated. And anyone who suggests that has just fallen under the spell of evolution. Because remember, those creationists, and there are many creationists, who look at a dinosaur like this Creighton, I guess it's Creighton aves. They look at this particular fossil and they say, like, yeah, this has combinations of typical dinosaur characteristics and typical characteristics of birds, like feathers, and plus other things. And they're not horrified by this. But neither are they under the spell of evolution, right? They believe in young Earth evolution. They believe that God made all the separate kinds. They just believe that this is a kind of organism that God created. He created an organism that has feathers and features that are similar to other dinosaurs. In other words, he designed this dino-bird-like organism. But Answers in Genesis, they see every instance of an organism that has shared features as being subject to the influence of evolutionary thought. And so work diligently to try to explain away anything that would suggest some such relationship. That's what this article is. We're not going to read it. I don't need to read you this article. It's full of lots of misconceptions, lots of not including the information that you really need to know, emphasizing particular characteristics, all to lead the audience to simply go like, okay, you're right, I don't have to worry about it. I heard about this article. It got a little scary for me because I heard that it had features of both organisms. That sounds like evolution must be true. We've just hand-waved this away for you. So what should they think about another alleged link between dinosaurs and birds? I'm just going to go to the last sentence. I think the last sentence will give you the flavor of this particular article. It has a supposed mix. She's just tried to argue in the article that it actually isn't a mix somehow. She's completely unsuccessful. Just going to warn you. Of primitive and advanced traits, which runs counter to what? The smooth linear progression from Archaeopteryx to albatross, which is what is always stressed in the dino to bird evolutionary story. Well, maybe in her kid's dinosaur book, maybe in her understanding of dinosaurs from 20 years ago, when we didn't have as many fossils, people might have talked about Archaeopteryx as having intermediate features, and therefore been an intermediate between dinosaurs and birds. That's not what any paleontologist... I mean, she has a PhD in paleontology. Hasn't she read any of the literature on these various birds? Doesn't she know that there are organisms like Velociraptor and relative to the Velociraptor that have feathers, right? And have advanced features that have similarities to birds, but they also clearly have lots of dinosaur-like features and clearly are lineages that are more dinosaur-like. And doesn't she know that no paleontologist is out there looking at a velociraptor that has feathers or like a microraptor and saying that microraptor is on a smooth linear transition line from dinosaurs to birds? Nope. They're a branch of dinosaurs that has evolved its own unique characteristics, including a variety of different types of feathers, right? And they went extinct. They're not on a linear transformational series going from dinosaurs to birds. It's a complex bush in which, yes, over time there has been the origin of flight, right? True flight. Some of the microraptors might have been gliders, and then there's there's some ancient fossils that have picostyles, which is a type which has to do with their the lack of bony tail, right, and a structure at the end of their posterior, and so forth, but no one today thinks that Archaeopteryx is the direct ancestor of modern birds. They think that a common ancestor that gave rise to Archaeopteryx, but Archaeopteryx itself has many advanced features along with other characteristics of dinosaurs that you could consider primitive. So it's like a weird package of features, right? It's its own lineage. And that own lineage was unsuccessful in the sense that it doesn't survive or persist till today. But there are other members of its ancestors that gave rise to birds. So in some sense, there is a lineage which can be of ancestors that eventually leads to the modern birds. But the actual fossils we have rarely are the actual ancestors. Some of them might be very, very close to being the ancestors in time. Many of them are advanced forms of descendants of the ancestors that were part of the linear progression to modern birds. This is just basic Evo 101 in terms of phylogenetic trees and the origin of species. Now, to the actual paper, just to reiterate this point, this fossil right here, this is the fossil we're talking about, has a lot of similarities in some of their bone structures to a bunch of things here, none of which, let me go back up here, which are in, which lineage is this in? Actually, they're related to this right here, cruciformes, right? Which is not in the lineage. No, today's the best knowledge we have today includes the best analysis of all the different fossils, is that this lineage is not a lineage. These fossils don't represent actual organisms that were ancestors to modern birds, right? Their ancestors were, but they themselves are not. They have unique features that don't get passed on and eventually become part of modern birds. And all these lineages here have some bird-like characteristics, and many of them are separate lineages that exist and then go extinct at different times. And only one of these lineages eventually survives to become the descendant of the modern birds. Just for kicks, I don't know how well you probably might not be able to say it because you can't, my face is on top of it here. The scapula length versus femur length, the ratio of the two. If you look at all kinds of dinosaurs, including T-Rex and so forth, see here's Tyrannosaurus right here. And here's Allosaurus, right? You're looking at dinosaurs and all kinds of birds. You'll see that they basically fall on a line in terms of a relationship. There's no clean break between the things that are obviously birds. There's a bunch of bird-like dinosaurs down here, which Answers in Genesis says are birds. And then you have reptile-like organisms, dinosaurs. And if you look at features like ratios of lengths of different kinds of primary bones, right? Skull bones and tibia and all kinds of things like that. And you look at these types of relationships, there's no like clear distinction between birds and dinosaurs. So there's like a gradual transition between the two. That's enough of that. Birds and feathers. Oh, what about dinosaurs and feathers? Let's just keep on going because Answers in Genesis can't stop talking about it. There was a report about beetles feeding on them. Well, there was beetles found in a piece of amber. It was like 100 million years old. So you can see inside this amber, and in that amber there is feathers, right? And they're saying that the type of beetle that was found is the type of beetle that actually would eat feathers even today. And so this was probably a beetle that was in a nest. That nest then had some feathers in it. And the nest that it was in, and that amber was in, is in a location where these are typically dinosaur-type nests, right? And so the article that Answers in Genesis is complaining about is they're complaining about the authors saying that these are probably some kind of ancient bird-like dinosaurs, right? That their feathers are being eaten by these specialized beetles. And they're like, well, how do you know that? Maybe it was just, real birds. Well, maybe they were more bird-like than they think. But they just get really upset every time that somebody mentions dinosaurs, saying that these dinosaurs had feathers on them. That's all I'm going to say about that article. It's just over and over and over and over again. They have to point out the error of this significant error. All right, I'm rambling. Let's move on. Practical prickles, more than a fashion statement. Interesting little critters. I had to learn a little bit about Tenrecs. First thing I want to show you is in the at the Ark Encounter. There is a chart there that tells you what all the different kinds are that were on the Ark. What are the representatives that were brought on the Ark? And I'm just circling right here that you have the Tenrecidae, which includes all the Tenrecs. I looked it up for Answers in Genesis. It includes all the things we call Tenrecs. And you might be like, what the heck is a Tenrec? All right, a Tenrec is a peculiar organism that's actually part of a very ancient lineage of mammals. And they look a little like hedgehogs. But they also look like a lot of things because there's a whole lot of diversity of Tenrecs. So I just really did a quick look, and here's a paper from 2008, Molecular Phylogeny and Divergence Times of the Malagasy Tenrecs. All right, And the other thing you should know about Tenrecs is they all live in Madagascar. All right, so it's a unique group to Madagascar. There's only a few major groups of mammals that live on Madagascar. And a lot of them are more famous than the Tenrecs for, like, the lemurs, for example. And the lemurs are famous for what? Like, lemurs are only found in Madagascar. There's 30 or more different species of lemurs, and the lemurs are have diversified into members that live in all different kinds of habitats on Madagascar, right? There are lemurs that live in the spiny forest. There's lemurs that specialize living on ground. There's lemurs that live up in trees. There's lemurs that are specialized to dry habitats, to wet habitats, to eating seeds, to, you can go on and on and on. They have lots of specialized features. Well, just take that and imagine, right? The same thing's true for Tenrecs, that they also live in a variety of different habitats. Some are nocturnal, some live during the day, some are active during the day, some of them eat, some are very tiny, and then some, so there's like several more orders of magnitude of size difference between them. Some are spiny, some aren't, all right? So there's a lot of different variety of them. And if you wonder how are they divided up, they're actually divided up into subfamilies, and of these horrors, they've been genetically sequenced, and what scientists suggest is, and the fossil record also suggests, by the way, the fossil record is Tenrecs have lived in Madagascar, right? Just like the lemurs. The lemur fossil record is in Madagascar, not in other countries or other continents. Is that Tenrecs are some 24 to say up to maybe 50 million years old. It's a really old group. And so this diversity that has happened over a long period of time. The genetic difference between different Tenrecs is enormous. I just did a video on canine diversity. These are much more diverse than canines, much different than foxes are versus wolves. All right, so once again, we have another example of an enormous amount of evolution is being foisted upon the young Earth creationist audience here. Because there's only 2 Tenrecs on the ark. Those 2 Tenrecs get off. They have to go to Madagascar. And then once they're in Madagascar, they have to diversify into these really different lineages, right? Which are genetically so distinct that molecular biologists look at that and say that that would have taken tens of millions of years to be able to sort that much genetic variation and create that much new genetic variation through mutations. This is a rambly episode of This Week in Creationism. I skimmed through I don't fully watch some of these videos. I skimmed through a video a couple weeks ago on Answers in Genesis YouTube site. And what caught my attention was the title of this one was Answering Your Tough Questions. And I wondered, like, how tough are the questions, right? Not so tough. I mean, they're answering typical questions asked at seminars, or in this case, this particular speaker had given a talk, and in the chat session, people had asked some questions. So he's answering some of those really tough questions. Newsflash, doesn't really answer most of the questions. He just kind of like uses those questions to say the same things that Answers in Genesis speakers say all the time. This particular speaker, I feel like, is just essentially reading a script on the Ice Age, and what answers, here's a PowerPoint presentation, here's what you say, and go give it in the lecture hall. And so I don't think it's necessarily all that well prepared to answer the actual tough questions, right? So it takes these questions from the audience and then just turns it into, here's the script I read, here's the slides we have that we always use to answer these sort of typical questions. But I did glean a couple things from this. One goes on and on and on about how one of the questions was like, how could you possibly get all that variation after the Ice Age? Because the questions were about the Ice Age. So the Ice Age wasn't very long ago for young Earth creationists. It was right after the flood. You had 2 dogs get off the ark, and then they became like all these dogs. How could that happen? And he goes through the story. And of course, the story really is about here's an example of all these different dog forms were formed in just a few hundred years. So therefore, all those species could have formed. So another thing that caught my attention was a few things he said about the horse kind. Right, he had said that in his original talk that all the different types of horses are all just one kind. And so therefore there were two horses on the ark, or two equines on the ark, that then left the ark and became a number of different species. Now we have like 5 species today, but there's like way over 100 different species of equines in the fossil record. And so all of those were formed from just 2 horses. And then the person asked, the hard question was, how do we know they're the same kind? Because obviously this person was thinking, I thought kinds were able to be reproductively, could cross with one another and have fertile offspring. But mules are not fertile offspring. So doesn't that suggest the horses and donkeys are different kinds? And he did a little thing where he said, well, like cats and lions can't reproduce either. But cats can reproduce with another species similar to it. And that thing can reproduce with cheetahs. And then that cheetah can reproduce with something like a leopard. And that leopard can reproduce with something like the lion. And therefore, there's kind of a connection between all of them, even if one of them can't cross directly with each other. It's sort of like the ring species concept we talk about in evolutionary biology, evolutionary theory. And so they say there is an interconnection between the genomes of all these different organisms. In the case of horses, saying, look, there's donkeys and he's explaining to this person that asked, there's donkeys and there's horses, and you hybridize the two, you get mules. And the reason you get a mule that's infertile is because they have different chromosome numbers, so therefore they get an odd number of chromosomes when they do this reproductive event. And that odd number of chromosomes in an individual makes it very difficult for that individual to do what? Have its own offspring. So the mule is kind of the end of the line. So he kind of waved away like, okay. And he then added, but mules sometimes can reproduce. The way they reproduce is they can back cross with a horse or a donkey. And some of the sperm and some of the eggs can fuse and form a combination of either 62 chromosomes or 64 chromosomes again, and therefore produce a fertile offspring. So everything's saved, right? We're still all right. All of these could be the same kind because it shows that their genomes are compatible with each other. But what this person who asked the question may or may not have really been thinking, but certainly the person answering the question didn't really address what I think is the more interesting question, and I'll say is the actual hard question for young Earth creationists, which was avoided here, which was, how did horses and donkeys come to have different numbers of chromosomes if they started out with the same number of chromosomes, right? There's two horses on the ark. Maybe they had 64 chromosomes. How did you end up with only 62 chromosomes in the donkey? I know what the answer is in terms of molecular genetics. There's a fusion of 2 chromosomes, right, to make 1 chromosome. So that's a loss of 1 chromosome, except there's not actually a loss of the actual information, right? It's just that you have the 2 chromosomes stuck together now. And since they're diploids, meaning they have 2 copies of their genome, that means it also is true for the other chromosome copy they have, which is why they have 2 less chromosomes overall. But if you ask yourself, how does that actually happen in the real world, right? It's a complicated set of circumstances that have to occur in order for you to have the fusion. And imagine the very first individual born with this fusion. They probably had an odd number of chromosomes. And then they had to, how did they pass that on to the next generation? There would have been a lot of difficulties in order to generate this. Right? And so I make it sound like this is not like an everyday occurrence, right? From molecular biology or molecular genetics standpoint, it's all possible. It's just extremely unlikely. Now, within the context of having tens of millions of years and hundreds of billions of reproductive events, you're going to have those really rare events where there's a survivor and that survivor passes on just the right combination of fused chromosome and you have an odd number of chromosomes in an offspring, and that offspring happens to meet another offspring that also has that odd number, and then when they reproduce, they end up with a better combination that then is compatible, or I guess you could say would be compatible with others that have the same chromosome numbers. And so you end up with a few individuals in the population that have these unique chromosome sets. And as long as they reproduce with each other, in which case most of the time they're not, but sometimes they accidentally do, you end up with creating more individuals that have those unique chromosome number combinations. And eventually you end up with another species inside of the other, what was the other species, because you have incompatibility between those two things. There's this whole scenario you can go through where you can transition chromosome numbers like this. But that scenario requires a bunch of extremely unique and highly unlikely events. When you have millions of years and billions of opportunities, unusual events happen all the time. In other words, I got 1 billion years and I have 1 billion horses. I can predict actually that it will happen. There will be individuals that will end up with different chromosome numbers. But if you have 2 horses and you have like 100 years and they're only going to reproduce a few times, you have a population of 50. The chances of hitting on that right combination in order to make this transition from 64 chromosomes to 62 chromosomes, and I'm not even talking about all the other different chromosome numbers in the other horses, or go to my dog talk that I just did, where some canines have 50 chromosomes, some have 78, others have 34. Right? To have those events happen within just a few generations, incredibly unlikely scenario within the young Earth creationist model. So this is another big challenge for young Earth creationism here. This speaker just kind of makes it sound very matter of fact. Oh, these 2 different horses have different chromosome numbers, without even any attempt to the audience to explain how in the world did they get different chromosome numbers. That's the bigger question for young Earth creationist. He avoids the hard question and just settles on answering the easy question, which is, you know what? They kind of do hybridize and they actually are somewhat successful. So their genomes must be similar. Therefore, they are the same kind. Let's move on to the next thing, is sort of the approach of the speaker. Let's skip over Ord's model. I was going to talk about mammoths getting buried, but I've been talking too long. All right, just for fun, this is what's clogging up my YouTube subscriber page. All right, Genesis Apologetics has been issuing dozens and dozens and dozens of little short videos. They're really chopped up bits of much longer videos. And you want to listen to something this is like completely brain dead material. This is like, you got different levels of young Earth creationist material. All right, I think there's some young Earth creationists that are deeply introspective, truly want to understand a world within a young Earth context, and are working hard to try to understand that. And as much as you might think that's impossible, they honestly and earnestly are doing that, and they're trying to do it faithfully, in the sense that they're trying to use the data that they have before their eyes, and they're trying to be honest with it. They're trying to show, like, here's what I don't understand, here's what I think we can do. And there's other tiers that are kind of like, just people that are zealous but just not very smart, right? And so are apt to use a number of different coping mechanisms for trying to maintain their beliefs. And then you got the bottom of the pile, right? You have those that just, are intellectually dishonest and make videos like this, like Genesis Apologetics, in which you have the super dumb high school teacher or college teacher, and you have the student that asks these like gotcha questions, and the professor was like, wow, you're right, I never thought of that. And so you see like, here we have epigenetics, Darwin's finches, fossil record, proof of Noah's flood or evolution, human chimp DNA similar. Is it really 98%? Right? 1 minute clips in which the student is making a fool of the teacher because he knows something that the teacher doesn't. I teach a lot of classes, and I really have never had a student that is this bold and thinks that they have the answer so clearly. And the sad thing is, if they really did think that they had these were actual questions that the teacher couldn't answer, and maybe many high school teachers can't answer these questions or are surprised by or not prepared for them. But they better not enter my class, because these questions that this student and others in this series ask of the teachers are so chock full of misconceptions that anybody that knows enough about science and enough about the world of young earth creationism will be able to easily pull out what the misconception is, right? Where do they not understand something in terms of what the question they're asking is? Because most of them are just inappropriate questions, right? They're not gotcha questions. They're just inappropriate questions that work if the other person doesn't know anything. And so completely uninformative, very uninteresting videos if you have any intelligence. I don't watch these. And neither am I going to comment on them, right? Well, I could bring up there's 40 videos that I could do. I could do a video on each one of these explaining the misconception of the student, but it's not worth my time. It's just not worth it, because they're not serious. I'm not going to take them seriously either. Okay, that's This Week in Creationism. I don't know, I'm being kind of snarky this week. Honestly, I get kind of tired. I'm kind of tired of reading some of these articles where you just see the same thing over and over and over again. And you know that you've addressed these things, and you know that dozens of other people have pointed out the very basic errors in some of these articles. And what's even more galling sometimes is that I know that young earth creationists have addressed some very basic errors in these articles. They have pointed out to their colleagues, that's a bad argument. And they turn around and make the same argument. Because it's not really about getting to the truth. It's really just about winning the debate. It's about the rhetoric. It's about it doesn't matter what the truth is about these scientific questions, really. We just care that, I think they're telling themselves we really care about their souls, right? And as long as we can get to their heart and have them understand the truth of scriptures, the gospel message, I don't know how to put this bluntly. I don't know how to put this not bluntly. Lying to get someone to what you think is the truth is, in my book, never a good policy, right? That's never the way to go about converting someone, to convincing somebody of a truth, is to have to lead them through the valley of error to find themselves on the peak of truth on the other side. It's just not the way it works. It actually does work, but that's not the way it should work. Yeah, that's it for me today. Thanks for listening. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.